Okay, welcome back everyone to the last lecture in this series. So for this lecture, we will be going through the 2018 H1 Csq2 on the economic growth in Singapore and other countries. So for this lecture, I'll be going through question D and E, which are the high order thinking questions. And before we even delve into it, right, because there are no more 9 mark and 12 mark questions in our syllabus, we'll change them to 8 marks and 10 marks respectively. Okay, so I look at this question, right? For part D, discuss the view that increased labor productivity through improved education and training is the best way to achieve faster growth of living standards. So this is growth of living standards. That's the endpoint, right? And is it the best way? So actually we can treat it as a policy question, right? And you can see that this is our supply side policy. Okay, for part E, discuss the case for government policy to aim at a high rate of economic growth regardless of possible adverse consequences. So here, right, very clearly we want to argue for the case that government should just aim for high rate of economic growth, and then we should argue that government should not because of the possible adverse consequences. So that way we already straight away we see what we need to write in the question. So let's look through the extract first, okay? Starting from extract 6. So extract 6 is not very important in a sense that it just gives us the income inequality, living standards, the GDP per capita data for a lot of countries. But then we move on to extract 7. This one just tells us the growth performance between Australia and Singapore. Extract 8. This is the more interesting extract, right? So when we look at the second paragraph, you realize, right, they're talking about why there's a slower growth of the economy, why there's a fall in growth of the economy, maybe even. So we look at the second paragraph. The main causes for slower growth in the future are suggested: a fall in the growth of number of hours worked, a fall in growth of capital stock resulting from lower investment, and a fall in the growth of productivity of factors of production. So we see something that is similar to what we saw in part D, right? So I'll highlight it. All three trends have been visible in recent years. The first thing to be said about possible growth enhancing policies is that there's no such thing as a free lunch. Thus, policies that are likely to enhance growth may well require greater saving, which means less consumption in the short run, lower standard of living now with the payoff of higher standards of living in the future. So there's this sort of trade-off that is being discussed here. Secondly, higher growth may have undesirable side effects, for example, on income distribution or the environment. So maybe these two are things we want to talk about when it comes to the undesirable side effects. There are a number of policies that can be used to enhance long-term growth. So this is actually a list of policies, right? And here they say many of these policies though require government expenditure, but it is more productive government spending than what we're having now, in which they exemplify as spending on welfare benefits for the elderly. And because we need more government expenditure, we might even need some modest tax increases. Okay, when I look at the last two extracts, right, it's actually very, very long, but the idea of productivity and inclusive growth, we can guess that it would be something related to inequality, income inequality, inequity, whatnot. So if we look at the second paragraph, at the same time, world income inequality has also increased. So bingo, we're right. And this just tells us how it has increased. So here, the third paragraph tells us why income inequality is worsening. In the case of the productivity slowdown, the most significant factor has been a reduction in investment in the most innovative firms and in knowledge-based capital. Okay, this is made worse by generally weak demand and investment since the global financial crisis. With regard to growing income inequality, government policies have tended to benefit workers in the most successful firms, and technological progress has probably pushed up the wages of the very high skilled, while slow growth of employment and weakened bargaining power has held down the wage growth for those in the lower incomes. Okay, so for the last paragraph, right, the implications on policies is that these different policies need to work together to solve the problems, right? So they're just talking about how they can work together, blah, blah, blah. Okay, for last extract, ensuring that growth is more inclusive. So this is something that directly talks to our last question, part E, right? So we want to read it closely. As Singapore positions itself for the next phase of its economic development, one key area of focus for policymakers will be to ensure that nobody is left behind. Inclusive growth, right? Several key measures have already been put in place, focusing on encouraging workers to improve their skills and so their incomes throughout their careers. Others target the position of lower paid workers in particular, whilst yet others are aimed at those who have retired from the workforce. At the same time, careful notice has been taken of the need for such redistributive policies to be financially sustainable. So this is like a possible limitation, right? It may not be very financially sustainable. So I look at my part D, right? We've already discussed what we need to write for part D, but now we look at our key arguments. So before I even write, right, because I know this is a policy question, even though it is a higher order thinking question, I will milk most of my marks from explaining how the policy works, right? So here, you realize that the focus is I'll explain the policy and then I'll link it to the growth of living standards, the rate of growth of living standards. Standard of living, right? So my key argument one, I will explain supply side policies. Okay, so very quickly I'll just draw the graph. And then you see when my supply side policies, right? So this is my initial AS. And then let's say this is my initial AD. Okay, so this is my initial graph. And the idea behind this, right, is that through improved education, improved training, right, the focus is what? Increase in labor productivity through these things. So increase labor productivity, right? So I'll talk about increase in labor productivity will lead to a decrease in UCOP, right? And this is reflected by an increase in the AS. So my AS will decrease, my AS will shift downwards. So shift here. Right? And then you can see that there's actually an increase in real GDP. So the idea here is when there's an increase in AS, right, assuming AD is constant, how it works is that it increases the quality. So I'll give examples, maybe through such upskilling through Skills Future, because they didn't actually give a context or extract to refer to, right? So I may have to come up with my own examples. So Skills Future, I will lead to a increase in real output. Actually, by right, if I want to, I can also draw that the productive capacity increase, right? But I want to focus on economic growth here, so actually it's not as important. So I would say, assuming that maybe they are at spare capacity, the increase in AS will lead to a actual economic growth, right? Actual economic growth. Why? Because there's through the movement along the AD, and then after that you just explain how it goes. The idea is that at the end of it, there's an increase in real GDP, meaning there's an increase in household income, which leads to an increase in their ability to purchase and consume goods. Yeah, so because of that, there will be an increase in material standard of living for consumers, right? And because you see there's also a fall in unemployment, right? When there's increase in labor productivity, there's actual economic growth, and there is fall in demand deficient unemployment. And how do I reflect that on the graph? You see that the output gap has smallened. Initially, output gap is YF minus Y0 units. Initially, now it is YF minus Y1 units, which is smaller. So because there is more higher employment, right, you realize the number of unemployed people actually decreases. So it decreases the stress from unemployment, and hence, right, it decreases crime rates. So you might be asking, how does it actually make sense to decrease crime rates, right? Because you realize now that they have jobs, they have an income, right, the opportunity cost of committing a crime has now increased. The opportunity cost is the benefit that they could be having the utility they could obtain if they spend this additional if they don't commit crime, don't go to jail, and then focus on their job and secure their income, right? Beyond that, right, when there's increase in labor productivity, you realize that there's also assuming that their output required from them at work is the same, right? You realize there's an increase in leisure hours. And when there's an increase in leisure hours, they have more time to do what they want, they have more time to kind of enjoy the smaller things in life. So both of these, right, decreased crime rates, increased leisure hours, lead to an increase in non-material standard of living. Okay? And then after that, I'll write my limitation. The limitation would be for any policy that requires public education, upskilling, it likely depends on the receptiveness of the public, right? Receptiveness of the public. And not only does it depend on the receptiveness, you don't suddenly become very skilled overnight. So there's also a time lag to it. And because there's a time lag, you realize that it actually does not. See, the key here is that growth of living standards, right? It will probably increase. There will be an increase in standard of living at a slow rate. And that's how I link it back to the question, right? And then I look at my key argument 2. My key argument 2, I can bring in either I would bring in either of the demand side policies. So in this case, I choose interest rate monetary policy. Okay, so I will have to explain why interest rate monetary policy can help to increase living standards. So when I say interest rate monetary policy to increase living standards, right, I will know that most likely it has to be an expansionary monetary policy. So I'll explain EMP. They will decrease interest rates, right, by increasing supply of loanable funds and blah blah blah. So all the analysis part we should be very familiar with it by now. And then the cost of borrow, then we'll link back to cost of borrowing, and then we'll use the marginalist principle, the MB versus MC for consumers and firms. And then we'll talk about how it increases C, it increases I. And then here, the bulk of it, when C and I increases, right, if we draw our diagram again, let's say this P naught. Okay, when there's an increase in my I, increase in my C, right, what happens is there's a multiplied increase in AD, correct? So AD naught, AD1, AD2, and AD3. Y naught, Y1, Y2, Y3. So the idea is I'll have to explain a rise in AD, I'll explain my multiplier effect briefly, and then talk about how it increases my real GDP because it leads to actual economic growth, increase in GDP, increase in material standard of living, because now households have more income to work with, right? So this is how a monetary policy works. So it's a very, very standard explanation. And then when I talk about limitations, right, you realize as best as possible, I try to engage the case extract. So if we look at extract 9, right, the one that we annotated the most just now, we realize they say here, right, that this is extract 8. Extract 9, we realize that there was talking about productivity slowdown, right? They were talking about productivity slowdown, and a significant factor is a reduction in investment in the most innovative firms and in knowledge-based capital. Okay, so you see, right, that it may not be monetary policy may not be very useful in kind of stimulating a growth in living standards, because we quote extract 9, right? So we quote extract 9, the part that we just went through, and then we say that because there's very low productivity growth, right, it means that there's a weak growth in AD, correct? And if there's weak growth in AD, there's likely going to be dampened investment expenditure, especially from the fall in interest rate, right? So there's weak growth dampened I, correct? Weak growth in productivity and dampened I. And this dampened investments may actually lead, how do we link it back to the growth in living standards, right? Because there's a dampened I, actual economic growth will also be dampened, right? So material as well may not increase as much as we expect, correct? And because there's less investment, firms are less willing to invest in the economy, right? As said in extract 9, you realize that labor productivity increases are likely to be decreasing, correct? Because firms are not willing to invest, and then we'll go back to the argument on because labor productivity might just stay stagnant, their non-material SL may not change that much, or it might even worsen if labor productivity worsens. And that could actually have an adverse impact on non-material standard of living. So now, right, for my evaluative conclusion, this 2-mark evaluative conclusion, this synthesis, right, what I would write for it, we have our ATMS framework. How I would write it, right, is I would discuss which is better to achieve a faster growth in living standards. So achieving faster growth in living standards, you see, it's actually not so clear-cut in a sense, right? It is not about which is better at. It is about which one is better at achieving a faster growth in living standards. The idea is on the rate of change of living standard, right? And you realize that even supply side policy addresses both material and non-material, while interest rate largely focuses on the material standard of living, right? So if we really want there to be stable growth, want there to be fast growth in living standards, we would likely have to use both, correct? So I would likely use my short run, long run again, the idea of short run, long run, and I would say that we probably need a combination of both monetary policy and supply side policy. So I need a combination of both. Why do I say that? Because for my interest rate monetary policy, right, you realize that the impacts are felt a lot faster. And so actual growth, this rise in material standard of living, can actually be stimulated a lot faster as compared to supply side policies. And in some sense, my supply side policies, right, it aims in a sense to work more further down in a time horizon, so that you see this is like a short run measure and this is like a long run measure. So when we reach that, when supply side policy starts to take effect, right, my living standard will still be growing at an incredible rate. Okay? So, and plus, if interest rate monetary policy focuses largely on AD, right, you realize that you still need supply side policy to ensure sustainability of such growth, to ensure that sustainability, okay, I won't use sustainability because not environment, right? Ensure that growth can be long term. Right, because either ways, at the end of the day, to continue increasing my living standards, I have to increase my productive capacity. I will most probably also have to increase the productivity of my workers. Correct? So this is one possible angle that we can use our evaluation, and that is the whole essay. Give you about 3 seconds to take a screenshot of this. Then I'll move on to question E. Discuss the case for government policy to aim for a high rate of economic growth regardless of possible adverse consequences. So, interestingly enough, both the higher order thinking questions do not have a specific context tied to them, right? So here, it is very clearly, or rather it skews towards more of a thesis, antithesis sort of approach. So for my KA1, right, which is, I would say is my thesis lah, I would say that yes, governments should aim for a high rate of economic growth regardless of possible adverse consequences. Why? Because it could lead to sustained future growth for the economy, which will also lead to an improvement in the standard of living in the country. So how would I explain this? Okay, so when I say pursue higher rate of growth, right, I would say that I would talk about my material SOL first. Material SOL, why? when I pursue growth no matter what, right, there's an increase in income. And then this one, y'all can link it back to an increase in material standard of living yourself. And then for non-material SOL, as we discussed in the previous part, it will lead to a decrease in crime rates. Right? And then and then how does it help with sustained future growth, right? If I focus on EG no matter what, you realize that my growth, right, if my company persistently, or if my country, not company, sorry, persistently has good growth figures, there will probably be a better outlook on the economy. And if there's a better outlook on the economy, there will be an increase in investment. If there's good outlook, and an increased investment will lead to sustained economic growth. Right? Coupled with the fact, right, that there's an increase in income over here by people, right, if we choose to pursue economic growth, and this means that there's increase in tax revenue. And this increase in tax revenue can be used to finance even more investments. So you see these two investments thing, and then so we assuming that the rate of capital accumulation is faster than the rate of capital depreciation, you actually see that there's also potential growth. So there is sustained economic growth. So that is generally why we should pursue economic growth, right? It helps us attain good future growth figures. It helps us improve material standard of living, also improve non-material standard of living. But why would we not want to do so? Okay, so when I look at my KA2, my key argument 2, right, why would we not want to do so? We will talk about the possible, why would we not always want to aim for a high rate of economic growth, right? Maybe because the adverse consequences are very, very terrible, right? So in our extract 10, we highlighted the part where, is it extract 10 or? Let's see, there was a part on environment, right? Okay, this is about inclusive growth, but we're focusing on here, income distribution and environment. So we need to be very clear when we look at this question over here, part E, right? We want to focus on the possible adverse consequences, and they gave us two, right? They gave us environmental degradation, they gave us income inequality. So I would tackle that. I would say that no, we should not always aim for high rate of economic growth because it could worsen environmental issues and worsen income inequality. So these are the adverse consequences that we want to use to argue, right? So when I talk about environmental degradation, right, there are a few ways I can talk about it. If I say environmental degradation, I can talk about the idea of overusing non-renewable resources, which will lead to a depletion in such resources, and hence unsustainable growth, right? Unsustainable growth. Okay. And another part I can talk about is when I degrade my environment, right, you realize actually in some cases very high rate of economic growth, maybe if we use like a lot of coal to fuel our economic growth, it could lead to negative externalities, which could actually lead to pollution, which will also lead to a worsening of standard of living, correct? And then I could also talk about this. When I have unsustainable growth, why is it unsustainable? Because there's a depletion, my productive capacity falls. I cannot produce as much anymore, and it could actually lead to negative potential growth. Because to some extent, for non-renewable resources, I only have that much, right? I cannot, when let's say I have 5,000 square meters of land, if I use up that 5,000, I don't have any more. I only have 5,000. Okay. Another one I want to talk about is worsens income inequality, right? So you see, right, when we focus on a high rate of economic growth, it is likely going to lead to structural unemployment. Why? You see, extract 9, right? They talked about how when we focus on technological progress to for growth and everything, or even for growth, benefits workers in the most successful firms, pushed up the wages of the very highly skilled people. Correct? So when I focus on a high rate of economic growth, right, you realize that we will probably have to do this how? We will probably have to undertake some form of technological reform, technological transformation, right? And this will lead to structural unemployment. And then I will quote the extract 9, right? Quote extract. And then I'll explain. Because maybe we have to use new technologies to bolster our economic growth, blah, blah, blah. It will actually lead to a widening income gap between the higher skilled and the lower skilled workers. And this would worsen income inequality. And then now it would worsen the issue of inequity, right? Because now the higher skilled workers are paid a lot more than the less skilled workers. Okay, and then this could actually result in them having lowered standard of living or stagnant standard of living. While the upper echelon of society may be enjoying a lot of these riches. And you can actually look, if we want to back it up, right, we see this table over here. Table 1. All this data over here, right, it can show us that for the two countries with the very, very high GDP per capita, right, let's look at, for example, Hong Kong or Singapore, you realize that our Gini coefficient is actually significantly quite high. The income inequality is actually quite significant. You look at Singapore. Singapore is the largest or the second largest GDP per capita, right? But our Gini coefficient is so much significantly higher than everyone else, significantly higher than the world average. Alright, so that's actually substantiating our point on the worsening income inequality, the worsening inequity, because maybe the higher skilled, maybe their wages keep going up, and then but on the other hand, the weaker skilled or the lower skilled, less skilled labor, right, more and more of their functions can be substituted by capital goods, can be substituted by automation. You realize that these things actually depress their wages just to aim for economic growth. So now I look at my evaluative conclusion, right? When I talk about my evaluative conclusion, how would I conclude? I would likely say, right, that it doesn't make sense for us to always aim for a higher, very, very high rate of economic growth, but it doesn't make sense for us not to aim for economic growth. So we want to have a nuanced stand, a balanced stand, right? We should say that they should not be aiming for high rate of economic growth regardless of whatever happens. Rather, they should aim for a moderate, an acceptable rate of economic growth, moderate rate of economic growth, plus manage possible adverse consequences so that the growth is sustainable, the growth is inclusive, right? So ensure that so we will use just, actually if you want another line of evaluation, just use any one of your ATMS angles. But I like this because it is a bit more nuanced in the sense it's not really dichotomous. It's not presenting itself as dichotomous. It's rather making a more well-reasoned stand, a more well-substantiated argument. So I would say that depending on the type of countries, maybe countries which are, so I'll depend on the country, right? Countries that are very rich in natural resources can maybe ensure that they use their non-renewable resources in a sustainable fashion so that there's not much depletion of their resources, so that they can actually sustain their growth over a long period of time. But then for places like Singapore, Hong Kong, which are very technologically driven, right, we should try to, because we are so tech driven, we're so manufacturing driven, we have to deal with the adverse effects of maybe the externalities which comes from the environmental issues, right? From the pollution, the government probably has to invest in some of its funds into curbing those issues. So we would have to kind of, in a sense, strike a balance between economic growth and also the adverse consequences. We have to manage the adverse consequences and while also aiming for a logical and acceptable rate of economic growth. But you see, this is the type of country, right? So I have my resource rich, I have my manufacturing focus, and then another one I want to bring up, right, is the less developed countries. For countries with have high levels of poverty where people are really struggling to make ends meet, right, you realize that at this present moment, the most important objective that this economy might have is to allow the people to consume more, allow the people the ability to consume more, to increase their incomes. And in these scenarios, they are likely to pursue a higher rate of economic growth at this present period. Okay, so that is the kind of angles you can do. And another angle you want to do is that you can pursue high rate of economic growth, but you can avert consequences such as worsening income inequality by constantly encouraging upskilling people so that everybody benefits when there is an increase in economic growth. Okay, so this kind of policies will work more for economies which are reliant on their human capital, okay, which is like the skills, be it in maybe like, for example, like things like engineering or all those niche skills lah. So I will look at depends on the country, and then I'll expand from there. So this is generally all for part E. I'll give you about 2-3 seconds to take a snapshot of it. If not, we have come to the end of the lecture for the 2018 CSQs. If you don't understand anything, if you need any clarifications, please seek for your clarification from your economics tutors. If not, that's all I have. Bye bye.